The night I knelt on the cold floor of my own office and wept like a child, I was 55 years old. I had written 4 books. I had debated scholars on live television across 3 continents. I had spent 3 decades standing in front of cameras, in front of students, in front of packed conference halls, telling the world with absolute confidence that the resurrection of Jesus Christ was nothing more than a myth. A legend built by grieving people who could not accept that their teacher was dead and gone. And then he walked into the room. Did you ever spend so long building something, so carefully, brick by brick, year after year, that the thought of it being wrong doesn't just frighten you, it doesn't just embarrass you, it reaches into your chest and threatens to unmake you completely? If you want to know what I saw in that room, and what happened to every single thing I had spent my life constructing, make sure you subscribe. There are people watching this right now who are in the middle of their own questions, and I believe this story belongs to them. My name is Ismail Karim. And I need to begin a long time before that office. I need to begin with a boy and a very particular afternoon in a library. I was 9 years old. My uncle, a historian named Dr. Farouk, had taken me with him to the university library in Riyadh on a Thursday afternoon because my mother needed quiet and he had nowhere else to take me. He was not the kind of uncle who played games or told jokes. He smelled like coffee and old paper, and he wore the same gray jacket in every season. He did not talk to me like I was a child. He talked to me like I was a small adult who simply had not yet read enough. That afternoon, he pulled a heavy volume off a high shelf and held it in both hands for a moment before he passed it down to me. It was a history of the Byzantine Empire. The cover was worn smooth. He said, in Arabic, without looking at me, "Ismail, facts do not care about your feelings. They only care whether you are honest enough to find them." Then he went back to his own work at the reading table and left me to figure out what that sentence meant. I must have read the first 40 pages of that book that afternoon. I understood maybe a quarter of it. But something happened in me during those hours that I cannot fully explain even now. It was like a key turning. History, evidence, the past examined under clear and honest light, suddenly felt more solid than anything else I had encountered in my 9 years. More solid than school. More solid than the familiar rhythms of daily life. More solid, even, than the comfortable certainties I had grown up with. I went back to that library every single week for the next 3 years. Not because anyone required it, because I had found something that felt like home, to the part of me that never stopped asking questions. By 14, I had read more about the history of religion than most adults I knew. I had notebooks full of timelines, names, cross-references. By the time I entered university to study comparative religion, I was already arguing with my professors, not from arrogance, I want to be clear about that, but from genuine intellectual hunger. I wanted to know what was actually true, not what was convenient, not what was comfortable, not what the people around me had decided to believe before the evidence was fully in. My faith existed in my life the way the adhan exists in Riyadh. You hear it 5 times a day. You know its rhythm in your body before your mind catches up. I prayed. I fasted. I kept the practices. But even as I did, there was always a part of me standing slightly to one side, observing, comparing, asking whether the foundation was as solid as it was supposed to be. That part of me never fully rested. And I never tried to quiet it, because I believed that part of me was what made me an honest scholar, rather than simply a man who had inherited a conclusion. Which is probably why, when I discovered in my early 20s that Christianity made some of the most specific and verifiable historical claims of any religion in the world, I became consumed with the project of examining those claims honestly. I did not approach this as a hostile person. I had nothing against Christians as people. I found the figure of Jesus genuinely compelling from a historical standpoint. A first-century Jewish teacher who generated a movement that outlasted every empire that tried to destroy it. That is historically remarkable regardless of your theology. But the specific claim that this man had physically risen from the dead and that this could be historically demonstrated, that, I was certain, was where the evidence fell apart. That was where legend had been stitched onto history. And I was going to show exactly where the stitching was. My first book came out when I was 30 years old. It was well received in academic circles and modestly successful in the broader market. My second book, which dealt specifically with how early Christianity developed its doctrines, sold considerably better. By my early 40s, I had become the name that television producers called when they wanted someone who could dismantle Christian historical arguments on air without coming across as aggressive or bitter. I was articulate, I was calm, I smiled easily. I used phrases like, "The evidence simply does not support this conclusion," with a gentleness that audiences trusted, precisely because I did not seem to have an axe to grind. I seemed, and I believed I was, simply following the evidence. Students filled my lecture halls at the university. They took notes with an intensity that I found quietly gratifying. I was invited to government cultural forums. Journalists quoted me. A documentary about the historical Jesus used my interviews extensively. There is a particular quality to the pride that comes from being respected by people whose respect means something to you. It is different from ordinary vanity. It settles into your bones. It becomes part of how you understand yourself. After 30 years, I had stopped noticing it was there at all. It had become simply the texture of my life. My wife Fatima had adapted her life around the books, the way water finds the shape of whatever it is poured into. She was warm and patient and privately funny in ways that I did not always slow down enough to appreciate. Our home was orderly, comfortable, and full of a companionable silence that we had both come to accept as closeness. Our son Tariq was studying mechanical engineering in London. He called on Sundays. He was doing well. Everything was fine, that word, fine. I used it constantly without examining it. Everything was fine. The announcement for my 5th book changed the temperature of everything. The Resurrection, History's Greatest Misunderstanding. My publisher believed it would be the book that closed the conversation once and for all. Not just another contribution to the academic debate. A comprehensive, authoritative, definitive work that would demonstrate, from historical evidence, that the resurrection narrative was a legend that had developed over centuries, not an event that anyone had claimed to witness in real time. I had been building toward this book for years. I knew what it would argue before I wrote a single paragraph. The research, I assumed, would confirm and strengthen a conclusion I had already reached. That assumption was the foundation crack that eventually brought the whole structure down. I began the research in early spring, with the calm efficiency of a man who is not really researching, but confirming. Standard sources, familiar scholarly frameworks. I had used most of this material before in earlier works. I began drafting the early chapters, while simultaneously pulling together sources for the later ones, which I expected to be the most academically substantial portion of the book. It was while working through Byzantine archive references for those later chapters that I came across something I had not seen before. Several citations, clustered together, pointing to a group of early Christian writings that had received almost no attention in the mainstream academic debate on resurrection claims. I assumed they were peripheral for a reason. Scholars far more specialized than me had presumably looked at this material and found nothing that changed the picture. But I was an honest scholar, which meant I could not simply assume. I ordered copies. They arrived 6 weeks later in a padded envelope that I left on my desk for 4 days while finishing another chapter. When I finally sat down and opened it, late on a Wednesday evening with a cup of tea and no particular sense of urgency, I expected to read through the material in a few hours and confirm my existing framework. Instead, I was still sitting at that desk at 2 in the morning. What I found in those documents was not what I expected. Several of them contained language about the resurrection that was dated, by the documentary evidence itself, far earlier than the narrative of gradual legend development would easily accommodate. Not centuries after Jesus, not even decades after Jesus, within a time frame that put the claims in living memory of the events themselves. And several of these documents were demonstrably independent of one another. They had not copied from a common source. Yet they agreed on certain core elements, in ways that independent documents only agree when they are describing something that actually happened, or at least something that was being widely reported as having happened immediately after the event. I closed the envelope, made myself another cup of tea, and stood at my kitchen window for a long time. Then I went back and read everything again. I want to be clear about what did not happen. I did not have an immediate crisis of faith. I had a crisis of methodology. Every honest academic reflex I had developed over 30 years told me I could not simply explain this away without verification. I had standard responses available. Documents get edited. Later scribes add to earlier texts. Motivated copyists can make things appear older than they are. I applied every one of these frameworks carefully to what I had found. Some of those explanations held. Others did not hold as cleanly as I needed them to. Being the kind of scholar I had always told my students to be, I had no choice but to keep pulling the thread. I spent the next 3 months doing nothing but verification work. I traveled to Istanbul to examine a manuscript directly rather than relying on a copy. I sat in a small, temperature-controlled room in a museum and looked at writing that was nearly 2,000 years old with my own eyes. I consulted a specialist in ancient Greek texts at Oxford, a woman who had no idea what project I was working on and no stake whatsoever in my conclusions. She confirmed datings that I found genuinely inconvenient. I cross-referenced everything against Jewish historical sources, Roman administrative records, and the writings of early opponents of Christianity, and that last category became, unexpectedly, the most troubling material of all. Because here is what the historical record shows about the opponents of early Christianity in the 1st century. They had every possible reason to end the movement. Political reasons, religious reasons, social order reasons, and the one thing that would have ended it permanently and immediately was producing the body of Jesus. If the tomb was not empty, showing the body would have stopped Christianity before it began. The movement was centered entirely on the claim of a physical resurrection. Disprove that claim with physical evidence and the movement dies in its birthplace. No body was produced. The counter-arguments that the historical record shows us from early opponents are arguments about tomb robbery, about mass delusion, about motivated reasoning among desperate followers. These are arguments you make when you cannot produce the body. When you can produce the body, you produce the body, and the conversation is over. I had encountered this argument before and dismissed it. But sitting in the middle of months of primary source research, applying it specifically rather than generally, I found I could no longer dismiss it with the ease I once had. And then there was the matter of the witnesses themselves. I had always taught that religious myths spread because they offer comfort. People adopt legends because legends make life easier. They reduce fear. They offer community. They promise something beyond the ordinary. That is the engine of religious myth-making. But when I examined the behavioral record of the earliest people who claimed the resurrection was real, not the theological writings, not the doctrinal statements, but the documented behavioral history of what happened to them and what they chose to do in response, the picture was not consistent with people seeking comfort. People do not endure imprisonment, social destruction, and execution for something they privately know is a fabrication. That is not how human beings work. People who have invented a comforting story will abandon that story when the cost of maintaining it becomes too high. The earliest Christians did not abandon it when the cost became unbearable. They held to it with a consistency that the historical record documents across multiple independent sources. And the most intellectually honest explanation for that consistency, the explanation that requires the fewest additional assumptions, is that they believed they were telling the truth because something had happened that they could not explain any other way. I'm not telling you I was persuaded by these arguments alone. I am telling you they stopped cooperating with my conclusion. There is a difference that matters enormously. My publisher called twice in October. I told him the manuscript was progressing. Both statements were technically accurate. The manuscript was progressing, just not in the direction he had contracted for. My lectures began to show the cracks. Not dramatically. I did not suddenly start defending Christianity from my podium. But language changed. Certainties became qualifications. Students who had come to me for the satisfaction of watching a complex topic get neatly dismantled found themselves instead watching their professor say things like, "This source is more complicated than it typically appears in popular discussion," and "We should resist the urge to dismiss this question before we have examined it fully." One student, a sharp young woman in the front row who wrote better papers than most graduate students I had supervised, came to me after class one afternoon and said very directly, "Professor, you don't sound like yourself this semester." I told her I was being more rigorous. She accepted that, but the expression on her face told me she did not entirely believe it. A colleague, a man named Dr. Nassar, who had known me for 15 years, came to my office in November and closed the door behind him. He never closed my office door. That detail, the sound of the latch catching, told me everything about how serious he considered the conversation. He sat down, looked at me steadily, and said, "Ismail, I need to ask you something directly. Are you reconsidering your position on the resurrection question?" I told him I was re-examining certain sources. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I understand that's what scholars do, but I need you to understand what's at stake here. Your reputation in this field is built on a specific position. Your career, your television appearances, your books, the way your students understand who you are. All of it is connected to where you stand on this question. If you shift, it won't be seen as intellectual development. It will be seen as collapse. And the people who have been watching you for 30 years will not be kind about it." He was not threatening me. He was trying to protect me. I understood that then, and I understand it now. Everything he said was true, and the truth of it sat on my chest like a stone for weeks afterward. That night, I lay in bed next to Fatima for a long time without sleeping. She was still. I could hear the house settling in the quiet. I kept thinking about my uncle in that library. Facts do not care about your feelings. They only care whether you are honest enough to find them. I had built everything on that sentence. I had used it as the foundation of my academic identity for 30 years, and now I was lying in the dark, afraid of exactly what it was asking of me. December came. A Christian exchange student named Daniel Brooks asked for office hours. I had noticed him in class across the semester because he was unlike other students in a specific way. Most students in my class either performed agreement with my arguments or performed admiring challenge to demonstrate their own sophistication. Daniel did neither. He simply listened. He took careful notes in a small notebook. He did not seem to be constructing a counter-argument while I spoke. He seemed to actually be listening. He came in, sat down across from me, and said thank you. I asked him what for. He said that the emphasis I placed on following evidence honestly, regardless of where it led, had affected how he thought about his own faith. That sitting in a class taught by someone who took historical questions seriously had made him take them more seriously himself, and that he was grateful for it. Coming from a Christian student in my class, that was a quietly extraordinary thing to say. I told him I appreciated it. Then he said something I was not ready for. He said, "Professor, I've been thinking about something this semester. If truth belongs to God, then we never have to be afraid of where honest evidence leads. Because if something is actually true, the evidence will eventually point there. And if something isn't true, a person who genuinely respects evidence will eventually have to say so." He said it simply, without any pressure behind it. Like he was thinking out loud, rather than making an argument. I nodded. I said something professionally vague. He thanked me again and left. But the sentence did not leave with him. It irritated me at first, in the specific way that things irritate you when you cannot find the flaw in them. I had built my career on the premise that following evidence was what distinguished rigorous scholarship from blind belief. And here was a man with deep personal faith saying he agreed. That evidence did not frighten him, because if God was real and the resurrection was real, the evidence would not lead away from that conclusion. It would lead toward it, and if those things were not real, then an honest investigator would eventually arrive at exactly that finding, which meant that if I was finding myself unable to dismiss the evidence as cleanly as I once had, the intellectually honest response was not to stop looking. It was to keep going and see where the honest path ended. A few weeks later, just before the semester break, Daniel stopped by one final time. He handed me a small notebook, dark cover, nothing written on the outside. I assumed it was class notes he wanted me to look over. He said, "I thought you might want this. You don't have to do anything with it." Then he shook my hand and left. It sat on the corner of my desk for 2 days. When I opened it, there was nothing inside, except one line written by hand on the first page, in simple, clear lettering. "Seek, and you will find." No argument, no elaboration, no signature. I set it on the shelf between a Byzantine history text and a volume on Second Temple Judaism. And every single time I walked past that shelf, which in an office full of research materials was many times a day, my eyes went to those words. Not because I was looking for them, because they were simply there, quietly, waiting. The new year arrived. I threw myself back into the research with the focused intensity of a man who is partly driven by scholarly conscience, and partly, if I am being completely honest, hoping that more investigation will eventually produce the exit he has been looking for. The flaw in the chain. The document that explains the anomaly. The evidence that lets everything fall back into the comfortable shape he has spent his career defending. I found no such exit. Instead, I went deeper into the evidence than I had ever gone before, and what I found did not simplify. it complicated. I examined ancient creedal formulations that most scholars date to within a few years of the crucifixion itself, predating the written Gospels significantly, containing specific claims about appearances and witnesses in language that reads like the transmission of testimony rather than the construction of legend. I looked at early Christian correspondence, written during the lifetimes of people who would have been present for the events being described, written to communities that contained people who could have contradicted the claims, and yet the core claims went uncontradicted. Not because opposition did not exist, the opposition was fierce, but because the opposition's counter-arguments never took the form of saying the events did not happen. They took other forms. And that distinction, examined carefully across multiple independent sources, was not something I could continue to wave away. Entire chapters of my manuscript were deleted, rewritten from different angles. Arguments I had considered airtight now appeared to me as sophisticated avoidances rather than genuine resolutions of the historical questions. I was not writing the book I had announced. I did not know yet what book I was writing. I only knew that honesty would not let me finish the original. My publisher had moved from impatient to genuinely angry. Deadlines had passed. A second contracted deadline had passed. A television network that had been planning to feature the book sent a formal inquiry about the publication timeline. I had no answer for any of them. Spring settled over Riyadh. The rumors inside the university were no longer quiet. A formal colleague stopped me in the hallway near the faculty lounge and asked point blank whether I was, as he put it, losing confidence in my own arguments. I told him I was refining my research. He gave me the look that academics give each other when they suspect someone is no longer saying what they mean. My friend Dr. Haddad, the man who had stood beside me at my wedding, who had been in the waiting room when Tariq was born, came and sat across from me in the faculty lounge one afternoon in March with 2 cups of coffee and the expression of a man delivering difficult news. He slid 1 cup toward me and said, without preamble, "Ismail, I need to say this because I care about you. You have spent 30 years building your entire identity on a specific position in a specific field. Your books, your platform, your students, your public reputation. The way your colleagues understand you, the way you understand yourself, all of it is connected to where you stand on the resurrection question. If you move from that position now, it will not be received as intellectual courage. It will be received as professional self-destruction. Everything you have built will end. Not just change, end." He held my eyes when he said it. I held his back, and in the silence between us, I felt the full weight of what he was telling me. Not because it was a threat, but because it was simply the truth. I had known this was the truth for months. I had been circling it the way you circle a fire, close enough to feel the heat, not ready to step into it. He finished his coffee. He squeezed my shoulder once. He left. I sat there for a long time after he was gone. The weeks that followed were the loneliest of my professional life. I stopped going to the faculty lounge. I declined social invitations. I came home late enough that Fatima was usually already reading in bed, and I would sit in the kitchen for an hour before I could sleep. She did not ask questions. She brought food. She left it without comment. I think she understood that something was happening in me that language was not adequate to contain yet. I was not, in those weeks, a man in the middle of an argument. I was a man who had followed evidence as far as evidence could take him and found himself standing at a door that evidence alone could not open. The historical case had brought me to the threshold, but walking through required something I did not know how to offer from inside the identity I had constructed. The night everything changed was a Tuesday in late spring. I had stayed in my office until well past midnight. The building was empty. The campus outside my window was quiet. I had my desk lamp on and a cup of tea that had been cold for 2 hours. Stacks of manuscripts on every surface. 30 years of work, 30 years of conclusions, sitting in piles around me like the architecture of a life I had built on what I had believed was bedrock. I stopped reading. I sat in my chair and I looked at the room around me, and for the first time in my professional life, I did not reach for another source, another footnote, another cross-reference. I just sat there. And in the quiet, something I had been avoiding for a very long time surfaced without any effort at all. The greatest obstacle in front of me was not insufficient evidence. The evidence had been pointing in a direction I did not want to go for over a year. The greatest obstacle was me, my reputation, my career, my 30 years of public certainty. my books with my name on the cover. The students who had come to me for 3 decades because I was the man who knew. The fear, deep and specific and very real, that if I was wrong about this, then the version of myself I had presented to the world was not what I had believed him to be. That was the wall, not the evidence. Me. I sat in that office with that realization for a long time. And then I did something I had never done in 30 years of studying religion. Something I could not have told you I was capable of. I spoke out loud into the empty room. I said quietly, in the way you speak when you are not certain there is anyone listening but you are past caring about feeling foolish. If you truly exist, I don't want another argument. I want the truth. That was all. Just those words. Into the silence of my own office. And then the silence changed. I want to be careful here, because I am a scholar, and I spent my career demanding precision in the description of evidence, and what happened next is the hardest thing I have ever tried to put into honest language. The room did not shake. There was no sound. There was no light from anywhere except my desk lamp. What happened was quieter than any of those things, and more complete. The room filled with a presence, not a feeling. I want to be precise about this. Not an emotion, not a surge of sentiment, not the psychological phenomenon that I spent years explaining as the neurological response to spiritual expectation. A presence, as specific and undeniable and externally real as the desk in front of me and the manuscripts piled on it and the cold cup of tea at my elbow. And in that presence, Jesus stood. Not an image from a painting, not the Western artistic tradition's representation, not a vision in the way the word vision implies something fragile or ambiguous. A person, alive in a way that made everything else in the room appear pale and approximate by comparison. Alive in a way that answered, without a word, the question I had spent 30 years trying to resolve from the outside. His face held something I had never once encountered in any argument, any lecture, any academic conference, any personal relationship. Authority and love at the same time. Not in tension with each other, not one subduing the other, but both completely present and completely integrated in a way that I had no prior framework for. No anger. Not even disappointment. Something that I can only describe as a welcome so deep and patient that it reached back across 30 years of confident opposition and treated none of it as a barrier. He said, "Ismail, you searched history with your mind. I have been waiting for your heart." That was all. And every wall I had built over 30 years came down at once. I fell to my knees on the floor of my own office, and I wept in a way I had not wept since I was a child. Not grief, not shame, something I did not have a name for in that moment, and that I have never found a fully adequate name for since. The release of a weight so familiar that I had stopped knowing I was carrying it. The particular relief of a man who has been fighting something true for so long that when he finally stops fighting it, the first thing he feels is not defeat. It is rest. I stayed on that floor for a long time. When I finally got up and sat back in my chair, the manuscripts were still there. The desk lamp was still on. The tea was still cold. Nothing in the room had physically changed. But the person sitting in that chair was not the same person who had sat down in it several hours earlier. Something fundamental had been reorganized at a level that no argument, no evidence, no intellectual process had ever touched. I sat until the sky outside the window began to lighten. Then I drove home. I did not call anyone. I did not write anything down. I came into the house quietly, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table watching the city wake up. When Fatima came downstairs and saw me sitting there in my office clothes at 6 in the morning, she stopped in the doorway. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, "Ismail, what happened?" And I told her, "Not everything, not that morning. There are not words adequate to everything, but enough." And she sat down across from me, and she listened the way she had always been better at listening than I ever gave her credit for, and she did not try to explain it, or fix it, or categorize it. She just listened. In the weeks that followed, I made decisions quietly and without drama. I withdrew the manuscript. My publisher was furious. I had a single brief conversation with him, in which I told him the book was not going to be completed, and that I was sorry for the time and resources his company had invested. He made clear that he considered it a professional betrayal. I accepted that. I resigned from 2 public debate organizations. I did not issue a statement explaining why. I simply resigned. I remained at the university, because scholarship is genuinely what I am, and I was not willing to abandon it. But the purpose of my scholarship changed in a way that every student who had known me before and after could feel in the room. I stopped teaching to a conclusion. I started teaching to a question. There is a difference in how the air feels. Students can sense it before they can articulate it. I began hosting small seminars, by invitation, in a rented room off campus. No institutional affiliation, no agenda. I invited Muslims, Christians, atheists, historians, anyone who was genuinely interested in examining the historical questions around early Christianity with intellectual honesty and without the pressure of winning. The first few sessions were attended by people who came expecting a debate, who sat with their counter-arguments ready, who were prepared to perform. After about an hour of actual examination of primary sources together, something shifted. The armor came off. The questions became real. People left having been in a different kind of conversation than they expected, and they came back. Fatima started attending occasionally. One evening on the drive home she said, "These people aren't arguing with you the way people used to argue with you." I said, "No." She thought for a moment and said, "They're actually thinking." Tariq came home for the summer. We had more real conversations in those 2 weeks than we had in the previous 4 years combined. Not because I forced depth. Because something in me had opened that I had kept closed for a very long time, and he could feel the difference. On his last day before flying back to London, he said, "Dad, you seem like you actually have time now." He did not mean my schedule. He meant something harder to name. I told him I understood what he meant. The Bible that sits on my shelf now is not displayed prominently. It is not hidden. It is simply there, between a Byzantine history text and a volume on Second Temple Judaism, in an office still full to every wall with the books that have been my life's companions. It is opened every morning. Read the way my uncle taught me to read everything, carefully, without rushing to the conclusion, willing to be surprised by what the text actually says, rather than what you have decided it says. I think about my uncle sometimes, about that afternoon in the library, about a 9-year-old boy holding a heavy book about Byzantine history and feeling something click into place. I think about what it means that the sentence which became the foundation of my academic life, the sentence about facts not caring about feelings, the sentence about honesty being the only real requirement, turned out to be the sentence that eventually led me exactly here. I spent 30 years believing I was following evidence and fighting faith. What I was actually doing, I understand now, was following evidence while fighting where the evidence was pointing. Those are very different things. And the moment I finally allowed them to become the same thing, the moment I stopped managing the conclusion and simply followed the path honestly to its end, was the moment everything changed. The students who sat in my lecture halls across those 30 years learned a great deal of history from me. I was a thorough teacher and an honest researcher, and I am not ashamed of the scholarship, even the scholarship I ultimately disagreed with. But the former students who reach out to me now, the ones who have found me through the seminars or through people who know people, many of them say the same thing. The greatest lesson they took from Professor Karim was not a historical argument. It was watching someone who had built his entire identity on being right choose honesty over reputation, when honesty cost him everything. I do not think I could have chosen it without that night in the office. I am not sure my intellectual conviction alone was strong enough to pay that price. The evidence had carried me to the door. It had done everything evidence can do, but I did not walk through it with my mind. I walked through it on my knees. What I know now is what I tell every person who comes to my seminars, every student who catches me in the hallway, every person who asks me how a man who spent 3 decades publicly dismissing the resurrection ended up where I am. Truth has nothing to fear from sincere questions. Nothing. Not one sincere question. If something is actually true, following the evidence honestly will eventually find it. It may take time. It may cost something. It may cost quite a lot, but it will find it. And the person I found at the end of the evidence had, apparently, been patient enough to wait 30 years for me to stop performing certainty long enough to actually ask. If you are somewhere in that process right now, if you have been asking questions and finding the answers more complicated than you expected, if you have built something around a conclusion and you are starting to feel the foundation shift, I want to tell you that the complication is not a sign that you are going the wrong direction. Sometimes it is the most honest sign you have had in years. Keep following it. Keep going. Be honest about where it leads. And if you have ever built something you were afraid to examine, you already know what this story cost. You already know why I stayed in that office for so many nights instead of simply following the path where it led. What I hope you take from this is not my conclusion. What I hope you take is the thing my uncle said to a 9-year-old boy in a library a long time ago. Facts do not care about your feelings. They only care whether you are honest enough to find them. That lesson, the willingness to keep going even when the evidence is uncomfortable, is the thing I hope stays with you after this. If this story moved something in you, if it made you think about your own questions or your own walls, please subscribe. There are 2 videos on the screen right now, powerful stories about hope and faith that I think you will want to watch. We will see you in the next one.